It was a quiet night in a small town. The streets were empty and most people were already asleep. The clock had just passed midnight when Officer Daniel sat at his desk inside the police station, sipping a cup of cold coffee. He thought it would be another slow night with nothing more than paperwork and maybe a call about a barking dog or a neighbor playing music too loud. But the silence of the night broke suddenly when the emergency line rang. Daniel quickly picked up the phone, expecting a frightened voice asking for help, or maybe a confused person dialing the wrong number. Instead, what he heard puzzled him. On the other side of the line, there was no human voice, only heavy breathing and faint scratching sounds. He spoke into the phone, asking if anyone was there, but no one answered. The strange noises continued, and then the line went dead. For a moment, Daniel stared at the phone, unsure what to think. Calls like this could be a prank, but something in his gut told him it was different. He traced the call and found it came from an address not too far from the station, a quiet neighborhood where not much ever happened. Without wasting time, he called 2 other officers and told them to gear up. Something about that strange call felt urgent and he couldn't ignore it. The police car moved quickly through the silent streets. The flashing lights cut through the darkness as Daniel drove, and his partner sat tense beside him. When they reached the small house at the end of the street, it looked dark with only a weak porch light flickering. The front yard was quiet, too quiet. Daniel knocked on the door, calling out loudly, but there was no response. He tried again, his voice echoing in the night, but still no answer. Just when they thought no one was inside, a loud bark startled them. It came from behind the door, deep and urgent. The officers exchanged a look. A dog was inside, and it sounded desperate. Daniel decided to push the door open, and to his surprise, it wasn't locked. As the door creaked open, a large German shepherd rushed out. Its fur was bristled, eyes wide, and it barked frantically, running back and forth as if trying to lead them somewhere. "This must be Max," Daniel whispered. He remembered hearing about this canine who lived in the house with his family. The dog wasn't just barking for no reason. It was trying to tell them something. Max grabbed at Daniel's sleeve gently with his teeth and then ran toward the hallway, stopping to look back to see if the officers were following. The urgency in the dog's behavior made it clear they couldn't waste any time. They followed Max down the narrow hallway, their flashlights bouncing off the walls. The dog stopped at a locked door at the end of the hall. He scratched and barked at it, whining in frustration. The officers immediately sensed that something was wrong behind that door. Daniel tried the knob, but it wouldn't turn. The barking grew louder, echoing painfully in the small house. "Step back," Daniel ordered, and with one strong kick the door burst open. The room inside was dark and cold. At first they couldn't see anything clearly, but then a soft sound reached their ears, a faint cry, weak and trembling. When the flashlights swept across the room, the officers froze in shock. There in the corner were 2 tiny babies wrapped in old blankets, their faces red from crying. The room smelled damp and there was hardly any furniture. It was as if the space had been forgotten, hidden away from the rest of the house. Daniel rushed forward, his heart pounding. He bent down and gently picked up one of the babies while his partner lifted the other. The infants were thin, their eyes wide and scared, but they were alive. They cried softly, their tiny hands clutching at the officers' uniforms. For a moment, no one spoke. The reality of what they had found was overwhelming. 2 helpless babies had been left alone in this hidden room, and if not for the dog, they might have remained there unseen. Max barked again, circling the officers as if urging them to act faster. His eyes seemed almost human, filled with worry and determination. It dawned on Daniel that the strange call they had received earlier must have come from the dog itself. Perhaps in his desperate attempt to help, Max had pressed the emergency phone with his paws. Somehow the loyal animal had found a way to call for help when no one else could. Daniel carried the baby in his arms carefully, feeling the small heartbeat against his chest. He looked around the room and noticed there were no toys, no bottles, nothing that suggested anyone had been taking care of them properly. It was a heartbreaking sight. The officers quickly wrapped the babies tighter in their blankets and headed back toward the living room. Max followed close, still restless, making sure they didn't stop. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, the babies' cries grew softer, almost as if they sensed they were finally safe. The flashing lights from the police car painted the yard in blue and red, a stark contrast to the stillness of the night. Neighbors began to peek out from their windows, curious about what was happening. Daniel carefully placed the baby in his arms into the car seat that one of the officers had quickly prepared. The other infant was also secured, and Max sat at the open door watching protectively. For a moment, Daniel placed his hand on the dog's head. "You did good, Max," he whispered softly. "You saved them." The dog let out a low whine as if he understood. His tail wagged weakly, but his eyes remained locked on the babies, unwilling to leave their side. The officers knew this was only the beginning. Questions filled their minds. Where were the parents? Why were the babies hidden away? And how long had they been left like this? But those answers would come later. For now, the only thing that mattered was that the children were alive, and it was all thanks to a loyal dog who refused to give up. Back at the station, as the report was being written, Daniel couldn't shake the image of those tiny babies in the dark room. The way Max had acted, the strange phone call, the urgency of the night, it all felt like something more than coincidence. It was almost as if the dog had known that time was running out and had taken matters into his own paws. And so, the first chapter of the night ended not with answers but with an unforgettable mystery and a powerful reminder. In a world where many people looked away, one loyal K9 had stepped forward to protect the most vulnerable. It was a beginning that would soon lead to deeper truths that would leave everyone in tears. The baby's soft cries still echoed in Daniel's ears as the officers rushed them out of the dark room. The night air was cool, but even that small change seemed to calm the infants. Their tiny hands moved slowly, clutching at the officers' uniforms as if they knew they were finally safe. Max, the German shepherd, followed close behind, his steps fast and alert. He kept looking back toward the house, then at the babies, almost as if he was making sure no detail was missed. Daniel gently adjusted the blanket around the baby he carried. The thin little arms trembled and the baby's cheeks were pale. He glanced at his partner holding the second infant, and both men exchanged a look of concern. These children had been alone far too long. The ambulance had been called, and its siren soon broke the silence of the street. The flashing red lights pulled more neighbors out of their houses. People whispered from their porches and windows, their faces full of confusion. They couldn't understand why police officers were carrying babies out of the small house in the middle of the night. The paramedics quickly stepped out with warm blankets and equipment. One of them, a woman named Laura, gently took the first baby into her arms and checked for breathing, pulse, and responsiveness. The second baby was examined by her partner, who frowned slightly as he noted how cold the little one's skin felt. "They're alive, but weak," Laura said softly. "We need to keep them warm. They look dehydrated, too." Daniel let out a slow breath. At least they had been found in time. Without Max, things could have ended much differently. As the paramedics worked, Max paced in circles. His ears twitched at every small sound the babies made. When one of the babies whimpered, Max whined, pressing his nose gently against the child's tiny foot before an officer guided him back. It was clear the dog wasn't just a pet, he was their guardian. Inside the house, the other officers searched for clues. The living room had old furniture, and the kitchen was almost empty. A half-used pack of bread and a jug of water sat on the counter, but there were no signs of fresh food. The sink was dry, and dust had gathered in corners, making the place look abandoned. It felt less like a home and more like a shell where life had been paused. One officer called from the hallway. "There's no sign of anyone else here. No adults, just these kids," Daniel frowned. The scene didn't add up. Why would two babies be left in such conditions, locked away in a hidden room? He couldn't shake the feeling that something painful hid behind this picture. The neighbors, curious and worried, began to gather outside. An older woman from across the street stepped closer, holding a sweater over her shoulders. She asked in a trembling voice, "Officer, is everything all right?" "Whose children are those?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He didn't want rumors spreading before they had the truth. But the woman pressed on, lowering her voice. "I've seen a young mother living there. Poor thing, she always looked tired. Sometimes I noticed she left late at night carrying bags. She never smiled." Another neighbor joined in. "Yes, I saw her too. She was always in a hurry, never stopped to talk. Sometimes she looked like she had been crying." Daniel took in their words carefully. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place. There was a mother. But where was she now? Why weren't these babies in her arms? Back near the ambulance, Laura wrapped both babies in heated blankets and secured them in small carriers. The infants seemed calmer now, though their faces showed hunger and exhaustion. One of them let out a tiny yawn that made even the toughest officer swallow hard. Max stood near the carriers, his eyes never leaving them. His loyalty was overwhelming. Daniel crouched beside him, patting his head. "You're a hero tonight, buddy," he whispered. "You knew they needed help, didn't you?" The dog wagged his tail weakly, still watching the children. His alert eyes seemed to say he wouldn't rest until they were safe again. After the babies were settled in the ambulance, Daniel stepped back inside the house to look once more. The small hidden room haunted him. The walls were bare, the floor cold. The old blankets the babies had been wrapped in were worn thin, as if they had been used too long. In the corner there was a small stuffed toy, its fabric torn and dirty. It was the only sign that someone had tried to give the babies comfort. Daniel picked up the toy carefully. It was small, probably something the mother had held onto for her children. He couldn't help but feel a wave of sadness. Whoever she was, she must have been struggling. Outside, the officers started securing the area. Reports were filed, photos taken, and details recorded. But in the middle of all the official work, the sight of those babies never left anyone's mind. The youngest officer on the team admitted quietly, "I've never seen anything like this. It's heartbreaking." Daniel nodded, his voice steady but heavy. "We don't judge until we know the full story. But one thing's for sure. If Max hadn't acted tonight, those kids might not have survived until morning." The officers all looked at the dog, who stood proudly near the ambulance. It was almost as if Max understood the weight of the night. Soon the ambulance doors closed and the siren began again. The babies were being taken to the hospital for care. Max whined loudly when he saw them leave, his body tense. Daniel knelt and whispered, "Don't worry, they're safe now." "You did your part." The dog pressed his head against Daniel's chest for a moment before finally sitting down, exhausted. As the police cars followed the ambulance back toward the hospital, the small neighborhood slowly went quiet again. The flickering porch light of the house was the only thing left behind, a sad reminder of the night's events. Inside Daniel's mind, the questions only grew stronger. Where was the mother? What had driven her to leave her babies in such a state? Was she hurt, missing, or simply too broken to continue? Whatever the answer was, he knew one thing. This was no ordinary case. It was the beginning of a story that would touch the entire town and reveal truths no one expected. And in the middle of it all stood Max, the loyal K9 whose instincts had led to the discovery. A dog who refused to let two helpless lives slip away. For now, the babies were safe, but the mystery of the missing mother and the heartbreaking truth behind her absence still waited to be uncovered. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the faint cries of the babies. Wrapped in clean blankets, they looked much calmer than when the officers had first found them. The nurses moved gently, feeding them small amounts of warm milk and carefully checking their conditions. Daniel stood near the window, his arms crossed, his face heavy with thought. The babies were safe for now, but the question that hung in the air was heavy. Where was their mother? Detective Harris, who had joined the case after hearing about the strange midnight call, walked in carrying a notepad. He looked at Daniel and said in a low voice, "I've been to that house. It doesn't look like a crime scene in the usual way. No signs of violence, no forced entry, no drugs. Just emptiness. Like someone left in a hurry or someone gave up." Daniel nodded. "The neighbors said a young woman lived there. Always looked tired, always in a rush. That's the only lead we've got." As the babies were moved to the children's ward for continued care, Daniel and Harris began their investigation. The first stop was the neighborhood again. Early morning light spread across the street as the two officers knocked on doors, notebooks ready. The older woman who had spoken to Daniel the night before came to her gate again. This time her eyes were softer, as if she had been waiting for answers too. "I told you, officer," she began, "she was always alone. No husband, no family visiting. Just her and the children. Sometimes I saw her walk to the store late at night, carrying one bag and coming back with very little. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days." Another neighbor, a young man, added, "She worked at the diner a few blocks away. I used to see her walking there early in the mornings. But a few weeks ago, she stopped showing up. I thought maybe she found another job." The pieces started to fit together. A single mother struggling to work, raising two babies on her own. Something must have broken her spirit. Back at the police station, records confirmed the young woman's name was Emily Carter, 23 years old. She had no close family in town, no stable income for the past month, and her phone records showed no outgoing calls in days. Harris leaned back in his chair, sighing. She didn't just abandon those kids out of cruelty. Something pushed her too far, Daniel agreed. He thought of the empty kitchen, the thin blankets, the hidden room. It wasn't neglect in the usual sense, it felt like desperation. Emily might have believed locking the babies in that room was the only way to keep them safe, while she tried to find a way out. By late afternoon, a new call came through. A hospital nearby reported that a young woman had been admitted the previous night after collapsing on the street. She had been found unconscious by a passerby. When she woke, she gave her name, Emily Carter. Daniel and Harris wasted no time. They drove to the hospital, their hearts heavy with anticipation. Emily lay in a small hospital room, her face pale and her body frail. Her dark hair fell across her cheeks and her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of water. When the officers entered, her eyes widened with fear, then filled with tears. "Please," she whispered weakly. "My babies. Are they safe?" Daniel softened his voice. "They're safe, Emily. They're at the hospital being cared for. They're alive because of your dog, Max." Emily covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Her sobs were not loud but deep, the kind that came from a place of pain she had carried too long. The officers remained quiet, giving her time to gather her words. "I never wanted this," she finally said. "I tried. I really tried. When their father left, I thought I could manage. I worked at the diner, but then they cut my hours. The bills piled up. I sold everything I could, but it wasn't enough. I skipped meals so the babies could eat, but then I had nothing left to give. Some nights I just sat in the dark, praying for a miracle." She paused, wiping her eyes. "The last few days I couldn't even buy milk. I locked them in that room because I thought it was safer than leaving them out in the open. I went out to look for food, to beg for help. But my body gave up. I fell and I couldn't get back." The officers felt the weight of her words. It wasn't a story of abandonment. It was a story of struggle, of a young mother pushed to the edge by loneliness and poverty. Harris cleared his throat gently. "Emily, why didn't you ask for help?" "The community, the church, the authorities, someone would have helped." Emily's eyes lowered in shame. "I was too proud. I didn't want people to see me as a failure. I thought I could fix it on my own. But I was wrong. And my children, they suffered for it." Daniel thought of Max. The loyal dog had done what no human had. He had called for help when Emily could not. When Emily learned how Max had pressed the emergency phone, she let out a small, broken laugh through her tears. "He always protected them. Even when I had nothing, he stayed with us. Maybe he knew I couldn't do it alone anymore." The officers stayed with her for a while longer, assuring her that her children were safe and would remain under care until she was well enough to see them. They explained that social services would get involved, but also that the town was already showing concern and support. As they left her room, Daniel felt a heaviness in his chest. He had seen many cases in his career, some cruel, some careless, but this one was different. This was not about crime. It was about human limits, about what happens when someone has no one left to lean on. That night, Daniel returned to the station and sat with Max, who had been brought in temporarily. The dog wagged his tail gently, resting his head on Daniel's knee. "You knew, didn't you?" Daniel whispered. "You knew they couldn't wait any longer." Max's steady gaze seemed to answer, though no words were spoken. The investigation was far from over. Reports still had to be written, decisions had to be made about the children's future, and Emily's situation had to be fully understood. But one thing was certain. The truth was heartbreaking, and it changed the way everyone saw the case. It wasn't about a mother abandoning her children. It was about a woman drowning in silence, saved only because her loyal dog refused to stay quiet. The following morning, the town hospital was busier than usual. Word had already begun to spread about the strange story of the canine dog who had called the police and led them to 2 hidden babies. Nurses whispered in the hallways. Doctors spoke quietly about it in the cafeteria, and even patients who overheard the news shook their heads in disbelief. It wasn't the kind of story people could ignore. Inside a quiet ward, Emily lay in her bed staring at the ceiling. She looked weak, but her eyes held a pain that went deeper than her body's exhaustion. She had just woken up from a restless night, and the first thought that crossed her mind was her children. She sat up slowly, clutching the thin blanket to her chest. The door opened and Daniel walked in with gentle steps. He wasn't wearing his usual stern look today. Instead, his eyes were soft, carrying a mix of relief and sorrow. Behind him, a nurse followed, carrying a small clipboard. Emily's voice trembled. "My babies, are they all right?" Daniel pulled up a chair and sat near her bed. "They're safe, Emily. The doctors say they were weak and cold when we found them, but they're recovering quickly. They've been given food, warmth, and care. You'll see them soon once you're strong enough." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not only of sadness, they were of relief. She covered her face with her hands and whispered, "Thank God. Thank God they're safe." Daniel let a moment of silence pass before speaking again. "Emily, I need to tell you something. What happened last night, it's not something we see every day. It wasn't us who made that call. It was Max." Emily's hands dropped from her face. She blinked, confused. "Max?" Daniel nodded. "Your dog. He somehow managed to hit the emergency button on the phone. That's what brought us there. When we arrived, he led us straight to the babies. If not for him, I don't know what we would have found by morning." Emily's lips trembled as she pressed her hands to her mouth. A soft sob escaped her throat. He saved them." Daniel gave a small smile. "Yes, he saved them. He never gave up." Emily leaned back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling as silent tears rolled down her cheeks. He always stayed by their side. Even when I was too tired, too empty, he watched over them. I knew he was loyal, but I never imagined. Her voice broke before she could finish. The nurse quietly excused herself, giving Emily a moment alone with the officer. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Emily, the world will hear many things about this. Some people might misunderstand, some might judge, but I need you to know we see the truth. You weren't cruel. You were desperate. You were alone. That's what we want to bring out clearly." Emily looked at him with red eyes. "I never wanted to hurt them. I thought if I locked them in that room, they would be safe while I searched for food. I thought I'd be back before they even noticed. But my body, it failed me." Daniel nodded slowly. "We understand. And now the community will know the truth too." That afternoon, a meeting was held at the station. Officers, social workers, and community leaders gathered around a long table. The atmosphere was heavy. Detective Harris spoke first. "The babies are stable. Emily is recovering. The official report is being written, but we can't ignore the larger picture. This isn't just about 2 children found alone. It's about poverty, loneliness, and someone falling through the cracks." A social worker, Mrs. Green, sighed. "I've seen cases like this. People assume mothers who leave their kids are careless, but many times it's desperation. Emily had no family here, no stable income, no one checking in on her. She carried this burden until she couldn't anymore." Daniel added quietly. "And in the end, it was the dog who raised the alarm. That's what makes this so powerful. If a dog can cry for help, why couldn't people around her see she was drowning?" The room fell silent. Each person thought about the neighbors who had noticed Emily's exhaustion, but never stepped in. About the diner that let her go without asking if she was coping. About the system that didn't see her struggle until it was almost too late. Later that evening, Emily was finally allowed to see her children. 2 nurses wheeled in small cribs with the babies wrapped in warm blankets. Their tiny faces looked healthier already, their eyes opening and closing slowly as they made soft sounds. Emily reached out with trembling hands, afraid she might break the moment. When the nurse placed one baby in her arms, she broke down completely. She kissed the child's forehead again and again, whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Mommy's here now." Max, who had been brought into the hospital under supervision, wagged his tail when he saw the reunion. He padded softly into the room and sat near Emily's bed, watching with loyal eyes. When Emily bent forward and touched his head with her hand, she whispered through her tears, "Thank you. Max, you saved them when I couldn't." The sight moved everyone in the room, nurses, doctors, even officers who had seen the hardest parts of life. Some wiped their eyes quietly. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a moment of truth. News of the story spread quickly through the town. By the next day, newspapers carried headlines like "Canine Dog Saves Babies After Mother Collapses" and "Heartbreaking Truth Behind the Midnight Call." People who had never spoken to Emily before suddenly felt a wave of sympathy. Donations of food, clothes, and baby supplies began arriving at the hospital. A local church offered shelter for Emily until she could stand on her own feet again. But more than anything, it was Max who captured the town's heart. Children drew pictures of him, local shops put up posters calling him a hero, and one bakery even promised to bake dog biscuits in his honor. For Daniel, however, the deeper truth mattered most. He knew Emily would have to face consequences, but he also knew she deserved compassion, not condemnation. She had fought as much as she could until her body gave out. Without Max, the outcome would have been tragic. That night, Daniel sat alone in his office, writing the final part of his report. His pen moved slowly as he wrote, "The case reveals not just neglect, but human despair. Emily Carter did not abandon her children. She fought as long as she could with no support. The lives of the infants were preserved due to the actions of the family's canine dog Max, who displayed extraordinary instinct and loyalty. This event reminds us that help must never come too late, and that sometimes, even when humans fail, love finds a way to speak through unexpected voices." When he finished, he set the pen down and closed his eyes. He could still hear the faint cries of the babies from that night, still see Max scratching at the locked door, still feel the weight of carrying one of those fragile lives out into the cool midnight air. The heartbreaking truth was now clear. Emily had not been a careless mother. She had been a silent struggler, broken by loneliness. The real tragedy was not that the babies had been left in a locked room. It was that their mother had been left in a locked prison of despair with no one to notice. And in the end, it was Max, the loyal dog, who broke the silence, called for help, and saved them all. The days that followed were unlike anything the town had ever seen. What had started as a mysterious midnight call quickly turned into a story that touched every heart. People who once passed by Emily without noticing her now spoke of her with compassion. The image of the two babies rescued at night by their loyal dog stayed in everyone's minds. At the hospital, the babies grew stronger each day. Their cheeks slowly filled with color, and their cries grew louder, not from weakness but from healthy hunger. Nurses who had worked countless long shifts admitted they couldn't stop checking on them, as if the children had become everyone's responsibility. Emily, though still weak, visited them daily, holding them close, rocking them gently and whispering soft words of comfort. Max was allowed to stay near the hospital under special permission. Whenever Emily came to see her babies, the dog trotted along beside her, his tail wagging lightly. He sat close to the cribs, his sharp eyes watching as if guarding them against the world. Patients and visitors often stopped just to pet him, calling him the hero dog. Children brought him treats, and strangers bent down to thank him as though he understood every word. But behind the smiles and gratitude, there were also important decisions to be made. A meeting was called between social workers, doctors, and the officers involved in the case. Daniel sat at the long table, listening carefully as each person spoke. "The babies are safe for now," said Mrs. Green, the social worker, "but we must decide what happens next. Emily is recovering, but she will need counseling, support, and stability before she can raise them again on her own." Daniel nodded. He had thought about this often. "I agree, but I don't think anyone here believes she should lose them. She didn't hurt them out of cruelty. She was drowning in her own struggles. What she needs is help, not punishment." The others around the table agreed. It was clear the story wasn't about neglect in the usual sense. It was about survival, about a mother who had reached her breaking point but still cared deeply for her children. When Emily was told the decision that her children would remain in temporary care until she was strong enough to take them back, she cried, but not out of anger. Instead, her tears carried a mixture of relief and determination. "I'll do whatever it takes," she promised. "I'll take the counseling, I'll accept the help, I'll rebuild my life. I want my children back. I want to give them the life I couldn't before." Daniel, who stood beside her, gently said, "You're not alone anymore, Emily. That's the difference now." The community's response grew stronger each day. Boxes of food arrived at the hospital with handwritten notes for Emily and her babies. Bags of clothes were donated by families who said their children had outgrown them. A local church set up a small fund to help pay her rent when she was ready to return home. Even the diner where Emily had once worked reached out, offering her a position again when she was well enough. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt the weight on her shoulders lighten. She realized that she had been invisible before, but now people saw her not as a failure but as a mother worth helping. A week later, a small gathering was held outside the hospital. It wasn't an official ceremony, but rather a spontaneous act of gratitude from the townspeople. Families, officers, neighbors, and hospital staff all came together to celebrate the survival of the babies and to honor Max. The mayor gave a short speech, his voice full of emotion. This story reminds us of something simple yet powerful, that even in the darkest of nights, love and loyalty can bring hope. Max, a loyal canine, did what no human could do. He called for help. And in doing so, he saved not only 2 children, but a family from heartbreak. The crowd applauded, some with tears in their eyes. Max stood calmly beside Emily, wagging his tail, as if he understood the attention was for him. A small medal, shaped like a paw, was placed gently around his neck. Children cheered, and Emily knelt beside her dog, hugging him tightly. "You're more than a pet," she whispered. "You're family. You're their guardian angel." That evening, Emily was allowed to hold both babies at once for the first time since the night of the rescue. Sitting in a quiet corner of the hospital, with Max lying faithfully at her feet, she cradled her children against her chest. Their small breaths warmed her skin, their tiny fingers curled around her hand. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not just tears of sorrow, they were tears of hope. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. She had her children, she had her loyal dog, and she had a community willing to stand beside her. Daniel, watching from a distance, felt his heart settle. He had seen many endings in his career, some tragic, some unfinished, but this one was different. It was not perfect, but it was healing. In the weeks that followed, Emily began her counseling sessions and received steady support from the community. She moved temporarily into housing provided by a local charity. Volunteers checked on her daily, helping her with meals, baby care, and even teaching her small skills to manage better in the future. Every time she walked through town with Max at her side and the babies in their stroller, people smiled, waved, and sometimes stopped to offer kind words. "You're stronger than you think," one woman told her. "Your dog is a miracle," another said. Bending to pet Max, Emily would smile shyly, her eyes shining. She was no longer the tired, invisible girl walking home in silence. She was now a symbol of resilience, and her children were a reminder of how precious life truly was. One quiet night, as the babies slept peacefully in their cribs, Emily sat by the window of her small apartment. Max lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. She stroked his fur slowly, whispering her thoughts. "I almost lost them, Max, if it weren't for you. I don't know where we'd be. You saved them. You saved me." The dog gave a low sigh, his tail thumping against the floor. His eyes, steady and loyal, seemed to answer her without words. Emily looked out at the night sky, the stars scattered across the darkness. For the first time in a long time, the night didn't feel heavy. It felt full of possibility. Months later, Emily stood outside the diner where she had been given her job back. The babies, now healthier and stronger, stayed in the care of a kind neighbor while she worked. Max waited loyally outside the diner each shift, his tail wagging when she stepped out. Life wasn't easy, but it was steady, and that was more than enough. The heartbreaking night that had once seemed like the end of everything had turned into the beginning of something new. The story of Max and the babies became more than just local news. It spread beyond the town, inspiring people everywhere. Animal lovers praised the loyalty of dogs, parents held their children tighter, and communities began to look closer at the struggles of those around them. And for Emily, every day was a reminder of the lesson she had learned in the hardest way. That asking for help was not weakness, that silence could be dangerous, and that sometimes the smallest cries in the night could lead to the biggest miracles. As the sun set one evening, Emily stood on her small porch holding her 2 babies close. Max sat proudly at her side, his ears perked and his eyes watching the horizon. Emily whispered softly, "We're safe now. We're together, and we'll never be alone again." It was a simple moment, but one filled with more power than any grand speech. It was the closing of one painful chapter and the beginning of a brighter one. And so the story ended not with despair, but with hope. A mother reunited with her children, a dog celebrated as a hero, and a community reminded of the importance of compassion,